Just a quick trigger warning before the video. This video contains non-graphic mentions of sexual abuse. If you are sensitive to this topic, please take whatever steps you need to respect your mental and emotional health. Welcome to Beyond Religion, X2x2 Stories of Deconstruction, where we talk with people who have left the 2x2 church and whose beliefs have moved beyond Christianity and organized religion. I'm joined by Meliesa Tigard today. Thanks for being here, Meliesa.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to learning more about your story and also talking a little bit about the book that you've written. So before we dive into too much, how do you describe your current beliefs?
Well, my daughter took a religion class, so I know exactly how I categorize. I am a soft agnostic. And what that means is that I am not going to commit to, oh my gosh, there's nothing there and we absolutely know it. That's more of an atheist position, and that is my husband. Um, and where I'm at is more of a, we don't know. And who knows, maybe someday we will. A hard agnostic is, we don't know and we'll never know. And I just kind of leave open the possibility maybe we'll figure out more stuff, maybe we won't. And from my perspective, here's the way I would describe it. What we know from science is that matter and energy never end, they simply change forms. And it doesn't bother me at all to think that maybe consciousness is the same. Doesn't begin or end, maybe just changes forms. I definitely do not believe in the white male Republican God with a bad sense of humor. I think that people's belief in an anthropomorphized God who cares about whether you take this job or marry that person, I think that's ego. I think that it's like if you're standing watching the anthill and there's an ant down there that's saying to itself, that person up there cares whether I carry this crumb to the back to the nest or that, and that person cares whether I take this route back to the nest or that. I think it's as ridiculous as that to think that there's a God that created all the universe that cares about your individual decisions.
Yeah.
And I think that that's ego. You're trying to make yourself more important than you are. If in fact there is any kind of universal consciousness or whatever that is, I don't see it as being in any way involved in anybody's day-to-day life. And the picture that gives me peace, and this may not be true, but it does give me peace to think of it this way, is that if the body is the cup and the consciousness is the liquid that's inside the cup, at death, what it's like is that you take the cup and you throw it into the river. The cup is still there, and the water that was in the cup is still there. It's just that that water has now returned to all of the river. And
Yeah.
so that which identified itself as Meliesa is still there, but also part of all of the consciousness of all that is. And if you're looking at it from that perspective, it wouldn't even be seeing things from the matter of days or weeks, but it would be all the eons. Hence, I don't see any connection with being really invested in this person doing this or that person doing that. And so that's the way that I see it. My husband is more like when you die, you blink out like a light, and the consciousness is gone. And if that happens, you won't care.
Right.
So I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
If that's the truth of what it is that happens, I'll be fine with it when it happens. It does feel to me like my consciousness is more real than just a mirage created by this little meat sack that I'm wearing. It feels like there's more to it than that, but maybe that's ego. Maybe that's
True.
just me
Yeah.
being like the ant thinking that, that person up there cares about. Maybe I'm just trying to make myself more important than I am. And if I am, I still think that I should do good works while I'm here and try and, leave a legacy that is positive. All of that seems to be, that's what's important to me. This is the experience that I'm having. It's the life that I have. So let's do a good job of it. And if it all blinks out like a light at the end, okay.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I really like that analogy of the cup and the water. It's really. I mean, when it doesn't, as you said, we don't know one way or the other, but it's it's comforting to us little meat sacks down here to hold those ideas.
And it doesn't seem to me at all illogical based on what we know of the physical universe that consciousness is part of something larger.
But can I just get a little bit of background on how you got started in the 2x2 church? Were you born into it? Did you meet it later in life?
Well, like most of us, I was born into it. My dad's third generation, and my mom was raised Presbyterian and joined together with him. She says, no, it was her choice. I think it was all tied up in the relationship. So
Yeah.
the two of them professed together. And then he left when I was about 7 and decided that he was going to not be professing. She stayed professing, which then did a couple of things. It put me in the position of being raised in a divided home, which in the 2x2s means you lose status. And
Right.
as we grew, it became clear that none of us was ever going to marry a boy from a good family. That was not part of, because of the whole status issues with the 2x2s. The other part of that was that before my father left, I didn't realize you could leave.
Mm.
And this realization that I could one day leave was something that I sort of just took and tucked away and waited for the right time. And I, did a lot of things to try and, stay in the 2x2s as you do. But ultimately, I'm really grateful for the fact that he did what he did and left. He came back to the 2x2s after having some bad experiences and thinking that God was punishing him until he finally returned to the church. And I was about 16 at that point. So then he spent the rest of his life in the 2x2s. But there was, one of the exes said to me recently, it didn't take me very long when I moved to town to know that your parents were lower status. There was a thing.
Yeah.
And, that's always how the 2x2s work. There's always status issues. And his having taken his own way during the time that he did. His parents divorced when he was a kid, and his father stayed faithful and single from the age of 33 until the rest of his life, which is what they expect of you. And one of the top reasons that people leave. So that's where I come from.
Yeah, it's interesting that that your father, returned ultimately, but still set that machine in motion in your mind.
Yes, yes, and ultimately it paid off with, and there was always, as professing as I tried to be when I was a kid, I was always aware that there was some part of me that was going to one day leave, and I was fighting against it, but it was always there.
When did you ultimately leave?
I was 24 or so when I left. So I went into work when I was 20 and then got sick. And the story about the work was when I was 14, I went to Jack Price, who was an overseer, and said, "Am I being called for the work?" And he spoke in vague language, but what I heard was, "Yes, absolutely, 100%. You are being called for the work, and you can't date. So you have to keep your life pure from now forward and stay away from relationships that bind, and you must be ready to go when the time comes." So from there on, from the age of 14 until I went in the work, that was always sort of a back and forth struggle for me because I, like everybody else, I didn't want to go. And then eventually I did go in the work. And interestingly, so I got sick. I had to go home, had to have surgery, was there to recover for 2 months, stopped at University of Montana on my way back. And in one day I had been offered my scholarship, which was tuition fees and books, and my RA job, which was room and board. And it was all offered back to me just because I stopped in that day. And then I continued on and met up with my companion, Barb Coles. And she said to me, "How was it being back at University of Montana?" And I was like, "Well, to be honest, the more I was there, the more I wanted to stay. But I'm going to buckle down and I'm going to do this and I'm going to stay in the work because that's what God wants." And she was like, "Well, what if that's not? What if going back to the university is what you should do?" Because she believed that 20 years old was too young to be taking kids into the work. And when she had gone into the work, it had been you finish college, you work for a couple of years, you get your feet under you, and then you go. And she thought, and she'd been living with me for 7 months. She knew what my maturity level was at this point. She, I think she thought I was just too immature. I was basically still a child. And so she essentially gave me the permission, which I needed because I was never going to do it myself. And I'm so grateful for that now because how many years could I have spent there had that conversation not happened? Um, so, God bless Barb Coles because she did the right thing. And I'm sure that she told me she would never start a new companion again
Oh, wow.
because,
What a statement.
right? But she felt it was the right thing to do. And so I went back to University of Montana and finished. And then it was my last year of college, because I was now on a later track because of taking some time off. And by the way, they gave me back my tuition fees and books and my room and board, and they extended my scholarship a fifth year, which was not done,
Oh my
specifically
goodness.
because I had taken that year off in the middle, and managed to make sure that I had all of the support that I needed to graduate college. And it was to me, that was one of the telling things, was that when my life fell apart, my brother-in-law said to me, "Well, if you were my kid, I'd tell you you were on your own, and you would just if you're going to leave the work, you get no support if you're going to leave the work, etc." And that was the prevailing attitude. But it was the worldly people that we were supposed to not trust, the ones who were going to never come through for you, all of that, who bent over backwards and made sure that I was able to get back in and finish college and have a life.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing to hear that things really lined up
I
after that.
know. I know, because a lot of people leave the work in sort of a devastated, and
Yeah.
I'm really grateful that it didn't go that way for me.
So rewinding just a little bit, how old were you when you professed?
8. I was
8.
at
Okay.
Chelan Convention. So my dad leaves when I was 7, and then immediately after that, I get very serious about professing, which I think is me fighting against the realization that I could leave.
Right.
So I then double down on it. I get very serious about professing. I want to talk about meetings. I'm going to profess. And then I'm talking to June Douglas, who was our worker. And then she tests the meeting like 45 times. I know that's an exaggeration, but it seemed like there was a lot of testing meetings, and I never stood. And then in the spring, in June, we went to Chelan Convention, and I had already decided that I was going to be professing on Saturday night of Chelan Convention. Of course, we all know that they're going to test that meeting. And so that's how it happened. And then the following morning, I stood up and gave my testimony in convention. Like
Oh,
I
wow.
know, I know. And this was before the microphones, so nobody could hear me, and the people on the platform couldn't see me, but people around were like pointing, being like, "Hey, there's a kid here." Um, and so, I don't know why I did that, but and again, I think so much of this was me trying to prove hard enough that I was really in.
And you were only 8 years old, but you already knew, like, you knew what it would take to get the approval of, the people around you, I assume. Yeah.
And like many of us were raised to be, I was very definitely a people pleaser.
Hmm.
And I know that I really internalized those lessons about how you're never supposed to think about yourself. You're only supposed to ever take care of other people. And I was trying to please the authority figures.
Did you have any problems, like, after you professed? Did you, because I know a lot of times when kids are that young, there's a kind of a fear that is in there, the fear of giving testimony. Obviously, you gave your testimony right then, on the next day, but after that in meetings or anything, were you?
It did take me a little while to start giving my testimony in meetings. I know that there were some that I skipped before I actually started doing it. And I don't remember how many there were, but so it's interesting that I did it the following day in convention, then had a hard time in the meeting itself.
Right.
Um, and then when I was in 7th grade, now again, mom's professing, dad's not. We move. We're in a new town, and my sister and I decide together that we're going to stop professing. And part of it is because we can't do what we want with our hair. So
Okay.
we quit professing and go and get haircuts and start, feathered hair and all the whatever, so that we can look like everybody around us. And that didn't last long. I look back on it now. I don't know why I went back to it. I didn't reprofess in a meeting. I just started giving my testimonies again and came back into it.
A little rebellion in your early years there.
Yeah, there was a period of time when I was in high school that I tried again to quit professing, and this was over a boy because I'd been told by Jack Price that I couldn't date, but I had a boyfriend, and he was not professing, and because I lived in a very small town by this time, and there weren't any professing kids there, which is actually in some ways kind of a blessing because you can't go running around with the pack. And there were actually some get-togethers in that region, and I was never invited to them until after my father returned. And then I
Oh,
got
wow.
invited to a regional get together. So that's just a little interesting tidbit. But I tried to quit professing again when I was a teenager, and the elder came over to me after a meeting with tears in his eyes. And oh, we just wish you would come back.
You were at meeting, right?
Yeah, I was at meeting because I was forced to go.
Right.
I had told my parents I did not want to go. By this time, my father had returned to the 2x2s. So now I had two professing parents, and they decided that I was going to go, whether or not I wanted, and I didn't have to take part, but I had to be there. Well, then I get the guilt trip from the elder, and it was too much. I couldn't manage that. So I tried again, didn't make it. And then when I went to college, you would think a lot of people just leave and go to college and they just quit going to meeting. By this time, I had internalized it so much that I was just going to stay and be professing and, wrote and offered for the work and all of that stuff. Um, and it was not until after I came back from the work that I started kind of processing back out of the two by twos. And it's a long process, I'm sure you know.
Hmm.
Um, and I fought with it for a long time. I know that I was skipping meetings and coming up with excuses and, doing all of that kind of stuff for a while.
Is there anything about your time in the work that sticks out to you that maybe was starting to shift your ideas around Christianity and religion, or when did that happen?
When I was in the work, I was seriously depressed. And I you're supposed to be the happiest that you've ever been when you go in the work. So I feel like I went as far as you can go into the two by twos, and I wasn't happy or fulfilled. And I wanted to sleep all the time. And when I was awake, I wanted to cry. And I was bored. And I did not see it as any sort of a culmination of, yes, this is my rightful place and this is where I should be. And I can just, really take to it. It didn't feel that way at all. So I feel like potentially that feeling of disappointment, um, of the reality of doing what I had been told I was supposed to do, and it didn't yield what I was told it would yield. I think that's important.
You enrolled back in college and graduated, I assume.
Yep, I did.
At what point did you decide that you were going to leave, or that the two by two church just wasn't fulfilling what you were looking for?
So, my last year of college, I was sexually assaulted by the elder of my Bible study, and he had this is the Little Mouse story, the book that we're going to talk about later. Elder Mouse tells her a lie in order to get her alone,
Hmm.
and once she's alone, he attacks her, and that's all autobiographical. It's very similar to what it is that happened to me. It took me years to figure out that that was actually a setup, because I believed what he told me, and it just was. It was I was very naive, which I think we're taught to be very naive, and so I believed what he said, and he assaulted me, and I at this point. I had been involved in being an RA in the dorms for long enough that I had been through rape and sexual assault training. I had a friend who was doing peer programs on campus. I had met the people from the sexual assault recovery service and introduced them to the people in my dorms so that they would know where to go if this sort of thing happened to them. I had been sort of involved in some education and awareness around this topic. So when it happened to me, I knew where to go. And it happened late on a Friday. And like a good two by two girl, I waited through the weekend so that I could have my emergency on Monday between the hours of 8 and 5 when it would be convenient for everyone. But I wanted to die all weekend.
Wow.
And so on Monday, I went to the sexual assault recovery service and I sat down with Victoria. And this is the only time I've ever told the whole story of what it was that happened to me. It was very helpful to me that she labeled it for me. She said that is a felony sexual assault. And I needed someone to tell me the gravity of it because I had been gaslit for so long. And this wasn't my first sexual assault. I had the first one had happened when I was a preschooler. So, and this is very commonly the theme in two by twos, which I did not know at the time. I thought it was just my story. Um, and so I had put a lid on all of those previous experiences. But this one, I had someone who was, again, an authority figure tell me what it was.
Right.
And I made arrangements. I told the worker who was in our field, who happened to be the overseer at the time, and he arranged for my phone number to come off the list, and arranged for me to not be in the same meetings. And of course, that man continued to have his Wednesday night Bible study, and he was requested to go to counseling with another two by two, which I understand he did 3 times, which I said at the time was enough for him to do. 3 sessions is enough to lie, deny, and minimize, and that's all. Um, I took some time off school and went home, and he called me when I was there at my house, and I picked up the phone, and it's such a gaslighting conversation, because what he called to tell me was that nothing happened, but also that it was all my fault and that I needed to forgive him.
Oh,
All
God.
of that in the same conversation. And thankfully, because I had already been to the sexual assault recovery service, I was able to come back to him and said, what you did was deliberate, it was wrong, and it's a felony. It's called sexual assault. And I came back with him with that on the phone, and then told him to never contact me again. And that's when he went into the "you need to forgive me" thing, which is, and you've seen me write recently on your site about forgiveness and how it is weaponized. And my belief is that the way you support survivors is you talk about healing, and that is it. You can do everything you need to do to help a survivor by talking about healing. You can let go of the trauma, you can move on, you can do all of the hard things that you need to do, and it has none of the ugliness of forgiveness, which implies a relationship between you and them, and that you owe a person who did you wrong. And you don't owe them. And so my belief on this is the way we support survivors is, how can I help you? And what are your needs? And let's talk about how to heal. And and then go to therapies that specifically allow you to release trauma. Because everything that they say you get from forgiveness, you get from releasing trauma. And EMDR and somatic therapy are great for that. So I continued on with the 2x2s for a while. And then in the summer, I went to Post Falls Convention, and he was there, Post Falls, Idaho. The following week, I went to Ronan, Montana. The guy was there again. So instead of going to Manhattan, Montana, I went to Cody, Wyoming. But there were people at Ronan who knew where I was going the following week, and he showed up at Cody.
Oh my gosh.
Right. So 3 weeks in a row, I have to be in convention together with this man. And at Cody, I'm seeing this girl and her relationship with her dad, her very highly controlling, I would call abusive dad. And I can't protect her from him at the same time as I have to be here with this man. And I have also found out that my father has started drinking again. And I had let Barb know that my father had started drinking again. And I had a conversation with both of my parents where I told them that I had told Barb that he had started drinking again, and that Barb had let the workers in his field know, and that he could expect that there was some accountability. They were going to have to talk about this. And of course, he immediately came up with a cover story as to why it was that he wasn't actually drinking. And of course, it went nowhere. So, but that was a lot for one convention. And by the end of the convention, I had a hysterical episode that was probably a nervous breakdown. And I just couldn't quit crying. And the rest of the summer, I felt like my nerves had just been blown out. Like something would surprise me, and I couldn't calm down all day. And I described that summer as the summer that I watched the grass grow, because I just emotionally couldn't do anything else. And during that time, I made arrangements to spend my final semester in college in Rome, which was just me getting away. Um, and in the fall, I was doing a lot of self-help, personal growth. I went and I was seeing a massage therapist, and sort of, trying to like take care of myself, because I knew that I was emotionally kind of a shell. Um, and I was bicycling everywhere because it was, healthier, and just trying to get exercise. And so I'm bicycling home from this massage, and she's done this whole chakra clearing and, new agey sort of a thing with me. And I'm bicycling home from the massage, and it's like I hear a bell ring, and I have this moment of clarity, and I realize that I want to not go to meeting anymore. And I decide that I'm not going to. And I think one of the things that is really compelling to me about that story was I didn't admit to me. I wasn't on the list of safe people to know that I wanted to leave until that moment. And had you asked me a week prior if I was, thinking about leaving or whatever else, I would have defended the 2x2s and told you that that was not at all not at all the plan. So I made a decision to not go to meeting. And of course, now it just consumes my thoughts. I can't think about anything else. And I'm in this heightened anxiety place now. And I can't talk to anybody who's in the 2x2s because they're going to want to talk me back. But I've already been told not to trust anybody who's out. So I can't talk to them because they're going to try to get you out. So I don't talk to anybody. And I'm completely in this intense, and it's about 6 or 8 weeks that I'm in just this intense anxiety place. until I finally, on the phone, I break down to my best friend who is getting her degree studying cults. She's
Oh my.
majoring in sociology and is studying cults and has 2 or 3 years previously figured out that I'm in one, but has, when she tried to directly talk to me, I completely shut down. So she's already by this time realized that directly talking to me about it is a bad idea. Um, and so I break down on the phone with her and say, this is what I've done, and I'm afraid I'm going to lose my family. And to me, that's a big part of what makes it a cult. If you feel like you're going to lose your family if you leave, that's that's so telling. And so she called our other good friends, and they were all at my house immediately. And we did nothing together. We baked brownies. And this bestie that I had, the one that was studying sociology, had a dad who was a counselor. So she knew some things. And one of the things that she taught me is, and when you're in deep grief, feel free to do superficial things now, because sometimes that's as much as you can do. And she gave me permission at this moment in my life when I was consumed by anxiety to do dumb, superficial stuff. And so, what I did immediately in the aftermath of this was I decided it's not life choice week. And so, when it would come up in my mind, I would say, it's not life choice week. And I put a pin in it. And then my mom called me up shortly before Thanksgiving, and she said, I got a letter from your worker, and they said, and let me read to you what your worker has to say, which is that you haven't been to meeting in a couple of months. And I had it was a hard conversation. And I told her that I, didn't want to go, and that I wasn't going to meeting anymore. And she brought up a family that I had brought into the fellowship. So there was a family that had asked questions, and I got them to come to meeting, and I was part of the whole story of them becoming 2x2. And she said, what are they going to think? And I said, that is a guilt trip. And she said, well, so what if it is? And I said, I'm not going to ride. And so I just kind of set a boundary with her about that. And I didn't really explain a lot of the why that I was leaving, because I wasn't really solid with it, and I was afraid of being gaslit. And so what I did was just sort of left it with that. And her final salvo was, well, you're still invited home for Thanksgiving. And I said to my friends afterwards, this is what my mother did. She went to Sunday morning meeting and she said, we invited her home for Thanksgiving. We tried to love her, but she wouldn't let us. I had heard her say things similar to that about my sisters.
Right.
And so I assumed that, and I'm probably pretty accurate. That's what that was a way so that she could cast herself as being the good one. And I told her, no, thank you. I would not be coming home for Thanksgiving. And then she gave my phone number to some people, and I did have a conversation with a gal who had been in the work with me. And she called me up and said, your mom said you're not going to meeting anymore. And I answered, and she said, what's going on? What's it about? And I said, I got two big theological issues: homosexuality and feminism. Now, to go back, one of the things that had happened to me after I had left the work and come back to college is that I had become friends with a gay Buddhist man. And he, for some reason, saw the weird culty girl and thought that maybe, and kind of pursued a friendship with me, which was very interesting. Part of what had happened was that the day that I met him, a friend introduced us, and then we just ended up chit-chatting with each other because we got ignored by the others. And he was going through a breakup, and I was already kind of an empathic person anyway, so I think probably he felt that it was nice to talk to me. But for me, what happened in that conversation was that when he got talking about this breakup, I saw the pain go across his face. And I know what that is. You were in love with this person and you're heartbroken. And all of that dumb stuff that I had been taught about homosexuality and how it's just perversion and it's just a physical act and all of those things, it all stopped being true in a moment of connection with a human being who was having a real emotional experience. And from there, he and I became friends. He introduced me to other people. I had a lot of gay men who were friends of mine at this point. And I was seeing the ugliness of homophobia, how they had been treated, the shame. They were just normal human beings that wanted to be loved just like anybody else. And I got to see that the church was wrong. Because if I believed at the time that God is love, and you're asking me to take a stand against the love between two human beings, then the church is wrong. And that theologically was a big, and it was also external to me. I could defend someone else better than I could defend myself.
Right, right.
And in the course of my history degree, I got started taking women's studies, and I got my degree in history, but I took a lot of women's studies classes, and I started learning feminism. And this is where it sort of came into defending myself. And it was harder for me to defend myself, but I also was starting to see how patriarchal and sexist the church is. And I knew that I had been raised in rooms where women sat around talking to each other about their abusive marriages, and none of them were allowed to leave. And this is, I was at this point, I was kind of a commitment phobe, because to me, marriage was this ball and chain you got locked into where he was mean to you and you couldn't leave. And that was as I started studying feminism, I started learning about, relationship dynamics and how men treat women and all of these things. And I realized that the church was wrong about this too. That the church had been teaching women that they needed to submit and all of these things. And all that did was led women into abusive relationships where they were miserable, and then they tried to commiserate with each other and lift each other up and give each other support. And the church was the problem. Bad marriages and the patriarchy and the you need to submit, that was the problem, not the solution. And so these were the two things that I brought up in this conversation with this young woman who had asked me why I left. And when I said homosexuality, she went, "Oh, well, what does the Bible say about that?" And I said, "Well, then I disagree with the Bible." And then she was really shocked. She had nowhere to go from there. Now, ultimately, since that time, I have studied the origins of the Christian teachings on homosexuality enough to be pretty clear that I think there's a lot that's taken out of context.
Yeah,
And I'm comfortable with, I go to a church now where it is nominally Christian, and the pastor is Christian and gay, and his husband is an agnostic.
mm-hmm.
And and I'm cool with Christians who are cool with gay people. Yes. And it's kind of a litmus test for me. If you're the kind of Christian who's okay with gay people, you're probably enough of an open-minded person that we can have communion with one another.
I love that feminism and uh, homosexuality are the things that kind of were the cracks that open things up, and I think that's the case for a lot of people. And I can't say that it was necessarily for me, but the homosexuality piece definitely bothered me from a very young age. And I experienced all the classic homophobic messages as a kid, and it just never sat right with me.
I think it's because the church is on the side of oppression.
Yeah,
And it is the thing that unites those two issues and so many others. The church is on the side of oppression, and whichever kind of oppression any of us gets our eyes opened to, we see that the church is wrong.
yeah, that's true. It's it's always a restrictive and never opening its arms to anything really. You had already spoken to somebody and said, "I don't care what the Bible says about it." Was that kind of the entry point into examining more of the Bible and figuring out like what's going on?
I did the This Is Not Life Choice Week for about a year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was because it was too painful to look at. And so what happened was I went as far away from Christianity as I could. Now, I had a massage therapist who was doing chakra healing. So I'm like, I just went into new age, crystal gem, and metal magic. It is completely your own spiritual process. There's no control. I think I went as far away from control as I could and into a new agey sort of spirituality, and started really looking into what if there's things that are mystical and magical that are divine, but not an anthropomorphized God. And I was
Mm-hmm.
much more comfortable with that kind of a spirituality than I was with Christianity, because the 2x2s debunk everybody else who's a Christian church. I didn't start with going to them. And I know some people do, but
Right.
I just left Christianity entirely at this point. And it was years later that I reconnected with a friend that had been Christian when we were in college together, who had since left and gone through a journey through atheism, and was on his way to becoming a Jewish rabbi. And he had gone back and really researched the origins of Christianity. And at this point, he led me to some reading to do, and some sources, and through conversations with him, I learned a lot more about where Christianity comes from. And just like the 2x2s, the origins of Christianity are also pretty sketchy, because
Mhm.
this whole most of what we know of as the biography of Jesus, born of a virgin, castigating the elders age 12, turning water into wine, 12 disciples, some kind of crucifixion on a tree by the age of 33. All of these things are astrological. They're 500 years older than Jesus. They are pagan stories. The reason that there's 12 disciples is there's 12 signs in the zodiac. These all predate Jesus, and by hundreds of years. And early Christians knew this, and they actually argued back and forth with pagans as to why they were still right, even given the fact that these were pagan stories and had predated Jesus by 500 years or so. So they even acknowledged this. Now, today's Christians don't even know most of this. But once I knew that Christianity was based on a series of pagan stories, and that what we know of the biography of Jesus is mostly a pasting together of these pagan stories, then Christianity didn't hold much interest to me at all.
Mhm.
Um, but as I explored this whole New Age spirituality that I was into, I met people who didn't know the difference between their imagination and their intuitive or psychic power, or whatever that was. And I saw that what they were really doing was just making stuff up. And a lot of it was very fantastical, and it didn't make sense. I met people who thought that they had been abducted by aliens, and had whole stories about how we have this channeled literature that came from um, aliens here and there and wherever, and this kind of channeled literature, and it all, people just bring it in from God and whatever, and then you have to believe it because it came from God, which we're going back to. You have to have faith and not prove anything. And so as I see more and more of this, I think that at the beginning, magical thinking felt very familiar to me and was therefore attractive.
Right.
And as I did my deconstruction process, I started becoming skeptical about magical thinking, and ultimately decided that a lot of what people think of as new agey spirituality is just its ego, it's magical thinking. It's, and there's stories out there about how humans were just seeded on this planet by an alien race. And again, I think that's because you can't stand the fact that we're just a highly developed primate that is part of this ecosystem, and we're not really any more special than that. And it's cool what we are, but we need to
Yeah.
make it bigger. We need to make it more. Um,
Right.
and so eventually I ran into some atheists, and I became atheist influenced. And I think that what I appreciated about atheists was their skepticism, and they're willing to really look at and think about the things that we had been taught. So then I start looking at the magical thinking and thinking, maybe I don't so much believe that. And a lot of what I had believed was influences by other people who turned out to not be that reliable of a narrator. And
Mhm.
as I started seeing that this was a person who was kind of fantastical, and that I couldn't really trust the stories that they told that were in the here and now, then I don't think I need to trust the stories that they tell about the higher realms that they know about. Um, and ultimately, I just came down to, well, let's take a look at what we do know and what we can see and prove and measure, and let's start there.
Mhm.
And so for me at this point, it is perfectly acceptable, and I'm perfectly capable of living a deep, thoughtful, meaningful life and experiencing awe and wonder without any of it having to require magical thinking. And I think the myth that we were all taught was that magical thinking is required for a meaningful life. So let's let that go and say, what does a meaningful life look like if I don't have this magical thinking and believe in a God that cares about what decisions I make, or whatever else. Um, and what that looks like is, I looked at what change I wanted to see in the world, and then I went and built a business that does that. And I
Mhm.
started with basically nothing, and have built a trauma informed classroom that changes lives for people in their adolescence, and can open up doors of possibility that were never going to be there and can shift someone's entire trajectory. And we do that over and over and over. And I have hired and trained people who work here who are compassionate and loving and yet still push kids to work their hardest. And this thing that I built here in this little learning center that I created, it's a beautiful thing and it is a gift. And I am allowed through, and there is a Buddhist idea called right livelihood, where you do for your living something that is in line with your deeper, higher values or your spirituality or whatever you want to call that. That doesn't require any magical thinking at all. And here I am being the change that I want to see in the world and helping people's lives. It looks like me in the family that I have created, learning how to be genuinely loving and supportive to the children that I'm raising and to the man that I married in such a way that all of us find this family unit a place of healing and not a place where we experience all of the things that we did in the 2x2s, where it's, something that we have to get past and get away from. Um, I became very politically involved, and I am involved in what's happening right now in this political movement. And I don't want to go full into politics, but that is where my volunteer time goes. And I'm using specifically my skill sets, which, I'm good on the microphone. So that's where I am. And I'm the one um, giving people the philosophy of why we're doing what we're doing, and hosting and making our events here meaningful in how we are creating intentional community to change things in our local place and in our country. I'm also very involved and I mentioned that I have a church that I go to where the pastor is married to a secular person. And for me, in order to have spiritual community, I need to be with people who can equally value the secular perspective and not come in with something like, well, my God is still working on you and is going to get you, because that is disrespectful. And equal valuing of the spiritual and the non-spiritual perspective is to say we can learn from one another. And when I'm with people who are of the Christian background, who are willing to learn from me as well as have something to teach me, I can absolutely groove on those people.
Right.
And I don't have a problem with meeting with people who are of different beliefs than me. I have had my friend that I mentioned earlier, who's a Jewish rabbi. He and I have had some great moments where we really connected with each other and had some community that way. I have had friends who were Buddhist, same thing. So for me, connection and communion is about us having mutual respect, and I see it as a round table.
Mm-hmm.
When we have all of the spiritual perspectives and the non-religious at a round table, learning from one another, that is a useful thing. But as soon as, and I'm going to specifically name the Christians because this is where I live and this is what I see. As soon as the Christians stand in the middle of the table and say, we own it and we let you be here because it's ours, that's not a place that I want to be. And that's not something I'm going to give my energy to. And that's not something that I'm going to promote.
Yeah.
And I see that as a problem in Christianity. And I have had some really good conversations with people who are in Christianity, who've moved far enough along in their deconstruction to be genuinely respectful to the non-religious. But there's bigotry baked into the way that Christianity is being taught in many of the churches. And until that gets deconstructed and changed, many people, they mean well. They are really, truly trying to be spiritual and do good things and live a good life, but they're being taught bigotry in that process. And then their desire to do well in the world is being co-opted into this bigotry.
Right.
And I think that it takes deconstruction to get to where you can see and let go of that.
Yeah. I think that Christianity is more fundamentalist than we realize, than society realized. Even what we would consider probably mainstream Christianity has a lot of fundamentalism still baked into it. That it calls itself, oh, we're mainstream, but you have to look a little bit closer.
Christianity doesn't have to be based on the myth of the dying God man. That, by the way, is a pagan story. But as long as they are, as their central metaphor, taking this idea of the God who required the torture and death of his own son, but they're the same person, but they're not, but they're the same person, but they're not. If you don't get that, you're going to hell.
Yeah.
So all of that, if as long as this is their central metaphor, this is an abusive idea. This is oppression. This is why the church is on the side of oppression. And as long as they are married to this idea that Jesus died for your sins, and unless you believe on him, you aren't going to heaven, they can't open their mind to anyone else. If you take that and put a pin in it and say, all right, let's leave that aside for the moment, and let's look through the messages of the New Testament, and you go through the red letters, there's some lovely messages there.
And it's funny, just to kind of bring it back to 2x2ism. It's like back at the origins of, like, if you take 2x2ism back to where it really started with William Irvine just going out and trying to do his thing. And I'm not going to say that it was pure at that point. It certainly wasn't. But when you take it back to that fundamental origin, it was not nearly what it has morphed into, what it's been transformed into, as what we see it as today's 2x2ism.
Yeah, it's true. And they, but even William Walker was committed to this story that they were from the shores of Galilee, and
Yeah.
early on they committed to this story that they were the one true way of God.
Yeah, it transformed really fast.
It did. It did. I think this is a good point to talk about
Yes.
the book.
So just to introduce us just a little bit, so you have written this book, Little Mouse and the Purple Door.
Here it
Go
is.
ahead.
Little Mouse and the Purple Door actually came out of one of the X2x2 retreats that I went on. And much of the story is an allegory for my story. So what I wanted to do was to write a story where I take you through the feeling of being part of a high control religious cult, like what we were part of, and then how it feels to leave and to deconstruct. Because many of these things, you can talk about them intellectually, but cults don't convert you through intellectualism, and you don't leave through intellectualism. They convert you through your emotions, and it is emotions that get you to leave. And so this book, because it's allegory, I want to get you out of your filters and into actually feeling what it feels like. So there's things like the key that Little Mouse's sister sends her. That was the book, The Secret Sect, that my sister mailed to me. And I read it, and I was very skeptical at the time, but eventually that was a key to my deconstructing the beliefs of the religion itself. And I think I mentioned earlier that the assault in the book with the elder mouse is based on what actually happened to me. And when after Little Mouse leaves, and when she first goes through the door, it's dark and cold and lonely, and she doesn't know if the sun will ever rise. And I feel like, especially for those of us who left before the Dean Brewer scandal, we didn't have anybody to leave with. We left by ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
And most of us left everyone we had ever loved behind when we did that. I was in the fortunate position of having the friendships that I had developed in the RA position in college, and those were the women who came over to support me. So I had an outside support group, which you're not supposed to have. The 2x2s will try and keep you from having that. And it's in order to rope you back in. So she starts with going through and has this experience of outer darkness, and eventually the sun does rise, and she does find others. And where she goes is Rodent City, which ultimately I'm going to have to write another book where my characters break out of Rodent City, because Rodent City is the first stop on her journey, and everybody is still the same in certain ways. But she meets there a capybara, and it's named a capybara because that's my husband's favorite animal. And capybaras are also known for being very friendly and for being able to have these cross-species friendships with other animals. And so I wanted to sort of bring that idea in, and the capybara then becomes the guide. And that character is based on counselors that I have known, spiritual guides that I have known, people that have impacted my spiritual journey. It's kind of a composition character. It's not one specific person. And what the capybara says here is, not all villages are good places to live. It doesn't matter the size of the village or city, but the culture of the folks that live there. The city is many villages melted together. You can be part of this village or that village. You can change your mind if you outgrow one. Any village that teaches it's the one true mouse way will treat you badly because you can never leave. And that is what happened to us, and that is why one true ways are dangerous. You can never leave no matter what they do. If the elders in a village know you'll outgrow them, then they'll treat you with respect. They have to. And Little Mouse is astounded, and she'd always believed her village was one true mouse way. And she says, looking back, she'd never considered leaving, even though the elders and the merchants had done many unkind things. We were taught to look past all of the unkindnesses because
Yeah.
we were part of the one true way of God. And this idea that you have choice and freedom, and you get to pick your spirituality. It is a smorgasbord. Please go and sample as much of it as you want to. Go back for the things that you like, avoid the ones that you don't. And you have freedom of choice in your own spiritual life, in what you choose to believe. And nobody can stop you from that. And no one can control you. That is, I believe, the deconstructed journey.
Just for people that are watching or listening, this book completely caught me by surprise, to be honest. Like, you know, when Meliesa was gonna be on this podcast, I she mentioned the book, and I had known about it for a while and just had been sleeping on it, I guess. And I got the book, and I'm not going to give any spoilers, but by the end, I was in tears, and like it just really hit me really hard. Like, I think especially because like so much of the book is just our journey. Like it tells my story, and it tells the story of thousands of other people that we know. Thank you so much for sharing this gift with the world.
You're welcome. Yeah, it came together very quickly, and felt like it was. It just was. It was already in my head. I was already there, and like I said, I wanted it to be a way that you can feel your way through the journey. And I think that there are deeper levels of understanding that you can come into when you go into an allegory than you
Mm,
can when you're just doing this intellectual process. And I'm not discounting the intellectual process at all. I think it's been very useful. Um, but an allegory takes you out of your head and into your feelings in a way that helps you re-experience and experience from the other side, and then understand more what you've been through.
yeah.
And that was my goal for this book, is that it's a healing tool.
Yeah, and being a children's book, it's I mean, obviously it's a great adult book as well. But you can read this to your kids, maybe the kids that have recently made that transition out of the church. As we know, there's literally thousands of kids that have left in the last couple of years, and this can be a really good tool for just kind of putting a story to what they've experienced themselves.
And because all of us were taught that the world is this big, scary, dark place where no one's going to really support you, and where you're going to be lost and you're going to go to a lost eternity, all of us were taught to be afraid to walk through that door.
Yep.
And so now we have families and kids who are in the position where they feel kind of like they've been pushed through the door. And now
Yeah.
what? Right. And the answer is, there is connection and community for you. And you now have choices, instead of being controlled by a rigid theology that tells you you must believe this way. Now, some people leave the two by twos and go into other fairly strict, rigid churches because they feel familiar to them. And my hope is that for many of those people, like me when I went into magical thinking, that they ultimately, that is a way place. That's Rodent City. And that eventually they're going to move out of that into some larger community. Because the truth is, when you leave a tightly wound community like the two by twos, you're not leaving community entirely.
Right.
You get to go create your own now. And the ways that you do that need to be true to who you are. And when you do that, you're going to find that you are happier, more fulfilled, more emotionally healthy than you were ever going to be staying in a high control group that told you that you had to follow a certain set of rules and live inside of a box and be a specific person in order to be acceptable.
Yeah, man, I love it. I thank you so much for sharing all of that.
I've written the second book, which my publisher went out of business, so I haven't gotten it published yet. So I got to find a new, or not publisher, the illustrator. So I've got to find a new illustrator. But what happens in the second book is you read the sister's story. You find
Mhm.
out how she gets literally pushed through the door for not fitting in, and you also get a perspective on Little Mouse, who, when she tells the story, was perfect when she was in the church, But like many others who were innies at one point, she's mean to somebody who doesn't
Mhm.
fit.
Right.
And that I think is something that I needed to deconstruct as I went along the process, was realizing the unkindness and the meanness in me when I was a 2 by 2, and that I was part of an oppressive or an abusive system, and that I did damage to others. And I have some intense feelings about that. And I would like it's like when you get to the 4th and the 8th steps in Alcoholics Anonymous, where you make a list of those you've wronged and then you go and make amends where you can. I feel like that for us who leave, maybe that should be part of the process too, because although we were victims, we were also complicit in the system. And I think that in the X's community, we also need to have some grace towards people who are coming in now who have done damage. And we know that they have because we maybe know them personally.
Hmm.
Because there, but for the grace of God, go I. We all have that story where we did wrong to somebody because we were following the 2 by 2 beliefs.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. There's it's so complicated for people that are leaving right now, because of all the things that you just mentioned. There's hurt that has been done for decades, and it's not undone in a day. It's a process, and it's something that requires real work.
I spoke recently about how to get someone out of a cult, and the crux of what it was that I had to say about that is that it was the people who were outside who were kinder to me than the ones who were inside, and that ultimately was what drew me out. You don't draw someone out of a cult by confronting them and telling them that they're wrong and trying to throw to them, the badness of the system that they're in. You can't. You're just gonna send them further in. Also,
Hmm.
they've been taught to be just a little bit obnoxious and a little bit socially weird because that gives them negative experiences on the outside, which draws them back in. So you have to have a little bit of grace about the reactions that those people who are still in have. And then you have to have a little bit of kindness. And when I look at the gay man Bob who liked me, the culty girl, and I had a lot of homophobia going on inside of me, and he had the grace to be able to accept me and then slowly help me see that gay people were human and that gay relationships were real, full, um, real relationships. I remember a conversation where he took me out to coffee and he said, "These are the ways you treat my relationship like it's not a real relationship. And
Oh
I
wow.
need you to see me as a whole person." That was a hard conversation, but also one of the deepest, most real conversations, and some of the biggest learning that I did there was seeing the damage that I did. And
Hmm.
we all have to come to grips with that.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing so much, your life story, and sharing so openly with, well, all of that you've experienced. I think it's going to speak to, it certainly spoke to me, and I think it's going to speak to a lot of people that, have experienced similar things, or even the same exact things. Um, it's amazing how, all of our stories are different, and yet they're all kind of the same.
It's like we all had the same childhood. Like,
Yeah.
we start talking in the group and, somebody will mention a hymn or, how we took our dolls out of meetings and beat them or, all of these. And it's like, oh my goodness, there's people in New Zealand and Australia who had the same childhood as me.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy. Well, thank you again, Melissa, and to everybody watching or listening, definitely check out Little Mouse and the Purple Door. It'll be linked on this video, and it's definitely worth checking out. Especially if you're a 2 by 2, or if you've been anywhere around any kind of fundamentalist church. I think it's definitely going to speak to you.
Thank you.